to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. Do you wonder how your faith fits together with your profession? Well, join us as we explore how to live well at the intersection of two roads crossing.
Well, hello and welcome. It's that time again, time for Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. Once again, my name is Dr. Barry Schwank. I'm a veterinarian, a pastor, and your host as we explore the intersection of faith and veterinary medicine. Today is part two in a two-part series, which is part of a much larger series. It's like those Russian nesting dolls. We just start unpacking them, and they all start coming out. I've been talking with Dr. Rob Goodman on Wellbeing and CVM's initiative to help veterinary professionals with well-being. And last week, we started a conversation on emotional well-being and the struggle that many of us have with facing and trying to be in the act of continuously balancing the many emotions that we face on any particular given day. And I think, Rob, I think the first question I asked you was, where do we start? And then by the time we finished answering that question, it was time to stop. So I know I really appreciate this conversation. So thanks for sticking around and finishing it. Last time we really talked about that first step being asking that question, where am I? Being aware of our emotional state, our emotion as it comes to bear in different circumstances, and looking for those moments where God is present with us in the midst of all those emotions, the things that we're grateful for, and even the things that we're not grateful for, looking for how God is using that, so that we can be aware of what we're feeling, why we're acting a particular way. And that's really what I want to focus on today is response. So your emotional response when I said, hey, we have to wrap this up, was that a good response? I think you didn't yell or scream or anything, so I think that was a good. That's a good. But let's talk about that. Let's talk about emotional response. Why is it that that you and I can experience something very similar, and yet our responses are so different?
Yeah, I think there are two pieces of that. As an internist, there's the structure and the function. I always go back to, but one is that structure piece of how I'm wired, in personality. That our personalities are different, and so we have a different way of. All of our personalities are different, and so we have different levels of openness to new experiences, different levels of conscientiousness, different levels of extroversion or introversion. Different ways in which we try to structure or provide stability. So all of those things are different in us. Now then, where I am as a character trait is one thing, but what I want to do often requires me to act outside of that. And so kind of the most obvious of that is with introversion and extroversion. As an introvert, I would rather not speak in public. But the projects that I have in terms of, if it's in the clinic dealing with clients, if it's in the pulpit leading a church, if it's in pastoral counseling, if it's giving a presentation, all of those require me to step outside of what is truly my comfort zone, my character or my personality trait. And I do that because I think it's important. But there's also a cost to that as I do that, I'm depleting a little bit of reserve. And I think, for lack of a better word, we can call that emotional reserve, or personality reserve, character strength reserve. And I'm going to have to pay that back. And so as an introvert, I pay that back by taking time by myself to recharge.
Yeah.
And so recognizing that where I am in that emotional reserve place and where I am just in personality wise looks at, wow, that's why my response is going to be different from yours, and my response on Tuesday may be different from my response on Thursday.
Right.
And so that's just kind of the character side of it. And then there's also the circumstance side of it. What else has been going on? And I've been fascinated recently by the work that has been done on micro stress, those little things. And we're all aware of, well, that was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Right.
The way those little things pile up and the ways that the small challenges to our productivity, the ways that our emotional reserve is depleted, like we just talked about, and the things that actually provide those subtle challenges to our very identity as beloved. They start to add up, like sands in the hourglass or drops in the glass of water that at some point it overflows.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because as you're talking about that, my wife leans a little bit more towards introversion. I lean a little bit more towards extroversion. And it's funny because in a good portion of our work situations, my wife is a teacher, and someone who leans towards introversion, her emotional storehouse gets depleted over the course of the day. People constantly vying for her attention, her constantly being up in front of people. And when she comes home, the last thing that she wants is more interaction. And yet, there are some days where I'm working remotely, and so I'm doing a lot of things online, and I really don't have anyone around me. And my extroversion, I'm depleted because I'm working alone and don't have those interactions. And then comes the end of the day, and she pulls into the house, and the first thing that I want to do is fill my extrovert store tank by interacting with my wife, and my wife is already on E, which means that we're about to have a very difficult evening. Unless we recognize that, and that's how important is that for us to really be able to recognize those characteristics within one another, because we have that exact same, we're colliding in that exact moment in time, and yet we're coming from two totally different personalities, but also two different sets of circumstances that have contributed to it. So can you explain a little bit more about these micro stressors? Because now I'm interested. What are those things that kind of gnaw away at our emotional reserves?
So classically, we describe those as the things that challenge our productivity, the small barriers that get in our way of getting things done. So it may be that if we're working on a team, we don't trust our collaborators, and so we're worried about doing their job for them because we think they're going to let us down. We might have someone who's interrupting us or distracting us, even in a good way. If I'm focused on something and the phone rings, and I have to take my focus off of this and put it on something else, I'm disrupted coming back in there. And sometimes it's just that the demands of the day are greater than my capacity to, at least in my mind, my capacity to get all of them done. That I can't, if I can't order my to-do list into my day, there's a stress from that isn't always named, and it's not any one task of those, and so that's why we call micro stresses. It's not one of those. And as we look at that relational part of it, sometimes when someone comes to us and says, I'm just overwhelmed, our fixer mode comes in.
Right.
Well, if you just take that off, well, that's not the problem. And so that's part of the recognition of micro stresses. It's not any one thing, it's the number of little things. And so that look at what challenges my way to get things done, what challenges my ability to be present emotionally. So confrontations, that clash that may happen between you and your wife, if your extrovert meets her, your depleted extrovert meets her depleted introvert.
Yes.
There's going to be a clash in there without some relational awareness. And some communication, and I think we'll talk about that in one of our next ones as we talk about relational well-being. Again, a beautiful interaction there. And so those emotional reserves, and they're also those people who spread stress. The person who at the end of the day, as you're about to close your computer, there's a ding and there's an email that says, hey, I need this by tomorrow. Or, in our situation where we work with people across the country and even people around the world, the time zone thing, and it's not intentional when someone on the East Coast sends a text to someone on the West Coast, but it may be 8 in the morning there, but it's 4 in the morning over here. And so those little things that just make you go, again, they're not intentional, but they just deplete your emotional reserve. And then the highly political people, the political maneuvering that occurs in corporations. I'm sure it doesn't occur in churches or ministry organizations or vet clinics or any of that, but I've heard about it. And we recognize the politics of things, and it takes something to be in there. Knowing that there's this maneuvering that goes on of currying favor with the boss and how I get my projects in there. Some of that sometimes feels a little dishonest, and that can deplete our emotional reserve. But all of those little things begin to add up as micro stresses. And then there are the subtle challenges to our sense of identity. The ways that we're asked to do things that are outside of how we see ourselves. I think for us, euthanasia is one of those that is always a bit of that. Yes, intellectually, I can recognize it as a gift that we give to our patients, a gift of relieving suffering. But there's also the aspect of, I went to vet school to be a healer.
Right.
And so there's a part of euthanasia that's an admission of defeat. That's a challenge to, am I really a good healer if what I'm doing is euthanizing this patient? The ways that our belovedness is challenged. My again, spiritually and intellectually, I can know my identity is as a beloved child of God, but our little weapons of mass distraction that we carry around, with our instant feedback of likes and not likes, and our desire for feedback, and oftentimes feedback is silent. Especially you do a lot of work on Zoom. There's a silence to Zoom. There's a lack of feedback to that. The meeting's over and there's not the water cooler afterwards,
right?
That we're used to. And so even that questioning of, wow, I wonder how that was received. And you even have this delay running a podcast that we're recording today. It's going to be published in probably 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah.
And you may never hear if anyone appreciated it.
Right.
And so again, that I can know that I'm beloved, but if I don't get feedback on that, or if I get negative feedback from the people around me, it starts to drain my knowledge of my belovedness. And so those are the micro stresses that impact our emotions.
I know that I'm beloved, but I really want to know that I'm liked. Is that that's right? Well, how true that is. And it's like you said, it's not any one thing. It's all these little things that kind of eat away at you. And without even realizing it, different combinations of those hit you every single day. And it's funny, like how those combinations hit. You step out of the day and you say, oh, that was a good day, or that was a horrible day. And yet at the same time, you may not be able to put your finger on any one thing that made it wonderful versus what made it horrible. It's just all this little tiny stuff. And it's whether or not it got a full pound of flesh from you or not, as to whether or not it's deemed a success. And that's a really challenging thing. So how exactly do you manage that? So when we're talking about emotional well-being, right? It seems like, and forgive me for going back this way, but we first have to be aware of where we are, and then as we've been talking today, we recognize that there are these different sets of circumstances and things that are outside of us that are impacting us. How do we then manage our response, and how do we manage our emotional well-being so that we come through all of that in a place of health, as opposed to a place of self-destruction?
Yeah, I think that is the $1 million question.
Good.
And I wish I had the $1 million answer, but I have about the $2 answer out of that.
Oh.
First is looking at that personality and project. What am I doing that is asking me to step out of my comfort zone? What is the cost for that, and how am I building recovery into that? And part of my journey over the last year has been, after my father passed away a year ago, I took over the family ranch, and the looking at the regenerative agricultural space. How do I steward the land well? One of the very interesting things is looking at how you care for grass has as much to do with the recovery period as the insult. And so if grazing is the disruption, grazing once is good. The second bite really hurts the plant.
Right.
And so it's really more about managing grazing, is more about managing the recovery time than the eating time. And so really looking at and being able to step back and say, wow, these are the things that are really important to me. And I recognize that to do these, there is a cost. And I have to be able to pay that cost back, or I'm going to deplete that reserve. I'm gonna be in deficit spending mode, and the government may be able to do that, but the rest of us, eventually we hit bankrupt.
Right.
And so to actually structure our lives around the things that are most important, which means saying no to things that may be good but less important to us.
Yeah.
Which that being able to say no is an important skill. And often we have to rehearse that. I would really love to do that, and it sounds really important, but I'm not able to do that until 2027. Will that still be available? And having that, yes, this is good, and no, I can't, rehearsed in our minds helps us to do that in the moment. And then the other side is looking at micro stress, and again, the bridge to that is boundaries. So recognizing the things that are causing us micro stress in our daily lives, and reducing that in some way. Usually that's setting boundaries of some sort. And so if you're disturbed by a phone call that interrupts your work, put your phone on do not disturb as you work. It's setting that boundary. And it's funny, you and I grew up in the time where we didn't carry our phones in our pockets.
Right.
And there was a time when you're out of the house, and
Right.
I think I was 15 before my family had an answering machine.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and now we worry, wow, if I don't get this call right now, then something bad. I mean, there's this stress that we put on ourselves, but to be able to establish some boundaries around our productivity, so that that part isn't threatened.
Yeah.
To again reduce the reverberation. And so the kind of the classic example of that, we talked about people who spread stress.
Yeah.
To be a stress stopper. And so if I'm a middle manager and my boss says, hey, I need this report tomorrow by 8 a.m., I can either forward that to my team and say, hey guys, we got to work on this, or I can respond to my boss and say, hey, everybody's gone for the day, and I respect the time that they work and the time that they're off, and we will have it to you tomorrow morning by 10, but we won't be able to have it by 8.
Yeah.
And that takes courage to do that, but again, to figure out the ways that we can stop that stress from going further. Again, we talked relationally about that end of the day, we come from our workplace to our home life. Wow, how do I stop the stress that I felt in work from carrying over into my interactions with my family? And that may be that I go to the gym on the way home, and it's better for me to spend 45 minutes working out, then 45 minutes fighting with my wife and kids because I need to recharge. And doing those things to reduce the reverberation, and then the things that renew us.
Mm.
So the ways that, again, if my identity as a beloved child of God is what is threatened, then what are the ways that I am renewed in that belovedness? Whether that's times of prayer, times of being engaged in creation, whether that's times of creativity. The things that renew me are the things that I need to, again, put time in for, recognizing the cost and putting ways into my schedule to be able to pay that cost and to be renewed.
It almost, there is for me, one of the boundaries that I had to figure out was that God wasn't requiring me to be responsible for all the people around me all the time, for all their troubles and all their worries. And that renewal of that understanding of what Sabbath was, the idea that holy rest is not that you're not doing certain types of work, but rather it's that stepping back and allowing God to do work that he's promised to do, and stop thinking that I can fill his shoes and take another day of creation, right? And once I start, like, in every aspect of my life, recognizing that there's a moment where I need to stop laboring, like that duck paddling under the water. I need to stop. I need to step back. I need to let, I've done the planting, I've done the watering. I need to step back and let God give the increase, so to speak, and allow him to work. Let his yoke be the easy one, and let him, do all the things that need to be done. And that's a hard lesson, because I think most veterinary professionals we're fairly task oriented. We're type A, we're achiever. And like what you said about euthanasia is absolutely true. Like we can wear that as a badge of failure sometimes, or we can carry around doubt. Did we miss something? Did we do something wrong? We can carry all of those things, and emotionally it just can absolutely devastate us. So how do you, if you, I like the idea of resisting and reducing and renewing. What is it then, as we face, because inevitably we're going to continue to face stuff like this, even as we've done all of those steps? How then do we respond when we face something that is overwhelming or unthought of, or something that hits us at that right moment that kind of can devastate us?
And that's where grace comes in.
Mm.
And again, we talked earlier about the time to learn to dance isn't the night of the prom.
Right.
The receiving what God pours out continually, the practices of receiving grace, and the ways that we do that. For me, the practice of silence is a way that I still myself to receive grace. You mentioned the practice of Sabbath. I'm reminded of the old cartoon where the pastor comes home to his wife and says, "I can't take a day off because Satan never takes a day off." And she looks at him and says, "I think you need a new role model."
I like that. That's good. I have to remember
Even the simple practice of sleep,
that.
and I think sleep leads to silence, leads to Sabbath. That if we're burning ourselves out every day and not renewing in sleep, and again, if we examine that, that's a place where we're trying to be God and not allowing God to be God, and surrendering to God in sleep. So I look at sleep, silence, Sabbath, and then solitude, the extended times away for renewal, as part of that preparation. I think we talked about being in the Psalms and kind of rehearsing that, the ways that we are able to encounter lament, the ways that we're able to encounter our anger with others in the Psalms of imprecation. And at one point I looked at those as those are the Psalms I read when I'm mad. And God, may his wife be a widow, may his children be orphans, and nobody give them bread when they're hungry in the street.
That's right.
but if we have the discipline of reading the Psalms, we recognize the discordance of that when we're not angry and we read that, we recognize the invitation of, wow, that feels yucky to me.
That's right.
And being able to take, but it also feels very real. I can name names of, I won't, but I can name names of
Right.
people that I've been that angry with. And so that discordance of, I've been that way, and yet in the presence of God, it feels a little yucky, and bringing that into the presence of God and allowing, and ultimately God says something like,
Mm.
yes, I understand, and vengeance is mine, not yours.
Yeah.
And or sometimes God will say, yeah, and I love him too.
Hmm.
Um, which is even worse sometimes. Um,
Yeah.
the Psalms of remembrance of the things that God has done, and taking those and remembering the ways that God has been present in our lives.
Yeah.
And the Psalms of praise. Um, and sometimes going to those Hallel Psalms, even when we don't feel like praising, is a way of basically praising till we praise. And
Mm.
so looking at those practices of preparation,
Mm.
and then we come to those things of, wow, if I'm dealing with fear,
Mm.
as an emotion that has to be dealt with in some way, I can't go further.
Mm.
Then one is to say, wow, is that useful to me, or is it no longer useful?
Mm.
And if I think, wow, I think this may be useful, I think that this fear may be trying to tell me something,
Mm.
then there's a beautiful practice of welcoming prayer,
Mm.
of taking that emotion that I don't want to experience
Mm.
and welcoming it as a guest.
Mm.
Um, and really in the presence of God, having this conversation and saying, welcome fear, come and sit down,
Mm.
have a glass of water.
Mm.
What do you have for me today?
Mm.
Allowing fear to speak
Mm.
what is going on, acknowledging that, and then say, thank you, fear, for coming by today. Now I bid you a fond farewell. Um,
Mm.
and rather than, I mean, our other response is, wow, I shouldn't feel fearful.
Mm.
I know all of this. I shouldn't feel this way. I don't want to feel this way. I don't like to feel this way. When that feeling is given to us as for a purpose to tell us something is going on. And
Mm.
so to allow that feeling to tell us, and then to bid it farewell,
Mm.
um, can be a very useful practice. The other, sometimes, again, with fear, there is a time when it is no longer useful. It may have served its purpose, and it's no longer useful. It may even be a, a work of the enemy to make us fearful. And as we recognize that, to respond with scripture. And
Right.
so I love the work of the fourth century monk of Agrius of Ponticus,
Mm.
who he published a little book called um, Talking Back: The Way of Combating Demons.
Mm.
And he actually named the demons with the words we would use for emotions: the
Mm.
demons of anger, the demons of lust, the demons of gluttony. Um, and he went through and he said, when I feel this way, this is the scripture that I use.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, you can now go online and say scripture in there are books that people have
Right.
written, scriptures for when you feel lonely.
Right.
And they're good. I don't think they're as useful as going and saying, when I, Rob, feel this way,
Right.
I go to, I search and I find this passage to respond. I think they're a model rather than an invitation to say, wow, this is the emotion that I struggle with. This is the scripture that reminds me of the truth that I can talk back to that emotion with.
Yeah.
And oftentimes we have to work with those emotions a little bit.
Mm.
Again, they have a powerful voice, and so we we can say, I know you're saying this, but this is truth. But
Mm.
oftentimes, you know, just like in the garden, Satan comes to Eve and says, did God really say that you
Right.
would surely die?
Right.
You won't surely die immediately. Um, but to be able to say that's not entirely true because, or sometimes there's a distortion that comes in, and we might say that may be true, but a more helpful way to look at the future is this.
Mm.
And oftentimes our fear and our anxiety are things that are in the future, and we worry about things that haven't happened because they might happen.
Right.
And we get into that loop, and we can simply say the most likely thing that is going to happen, not the worst thing, which is where we
Right.
often go.
Right.
We often go to the worst thing that can happen is, and
Right.
I am powerless to do anything,
Right.
is to simply come back and say the most likely thing that is going to happen, and
Mm.
I can do this. To again come back into a more measured view, and a way of knowing, wow, I can pray, I can do this, I can work towards this. Is a way of talking back to those emotions that are no longer helpful.
I found that when Satan comes and says, "Did God say that surely you would die?" I found it very comforting to say, "I'm sorry, but God did not say that, and stop calling me Shirley." And that's the easiest way. That's the easiest way. Time to back away. There's a point where um, even the emotions, the good emotions that God has given to us, we can use to a negative end. When God gives us grief for a reason, but grief can become paralyzing to the point where we're no longer walking in His will. God gives us righteous anger, and yet righteous anger can be used to sin against others. And so I really do appreciate what you've shared with us last time and this time, being, I think, starting to have that conversation with yourself, with the people around you, being aware of where you are, recognizing what your personality and your character brings to the table, recognizing all those little things that contribute, and then being able to start to set up boundaries, to resist, to find that place of renewal and healing, to replenish that which was taken, and then finding that right response. And that the right response is always, "You have heard it said, but I tell you," and quieting all those other voices that you've heard saying things, and just listen to what God has in store for you, because, like you said, all those those emotions were given to us for a reason. So I appreciate you sharing with us on emotional well-being, and I hope that for the people that are listening, hopefully you've heard some things here that will help you get to a place of better health, that place of being able to be in the act of balancing all the things that seem chaotic to us, all those emotions that swirl around for various reasons. Hopefully, as we embrace what God has for us and use the gifts that He's given to us, allow His Word to have power and presence in our lives, then together we'll be learning how to live well at the intersection of two roads crossing.
Thank you for listening to Two Roads Crossing, a podcast production of the Christian Veterinary Mission. If you were blessed by this content, like and subscribe so that you are alerted when new content is released. If you would like more information about CVM, or if you have questions, comments, or topical suggestions, you can find us online at www.cvm.org. Or you can contact us by emailing podcast@cvm.org. God has a plan for the nations, and that plan includes you. We pray that CVM has encouraged you to live out your calling with confidence and competence. So, until next time, may the voice of the shepherd ring loud and clear as you follow him in faith to the intersection of two roads crossing.